الزفر العفر اللي يمتد قبالي شبر. يلا سمع الرصاص نزل بحفاي هل هذا طخ ضغط سلاي بالطين بنلطخ مش تنبيس هاد صوت كتسارة وصوت إماية ده صوت 16 يصبح في الجبل يحكي للبلد إنه اليوم مصى على 5 الصبح نطخ الديك فيش غير ناديك بالبلد جبل جرزين جبل أرجاز جبل شغلين طلع بجواز أنا لهالتيت مش الضريب أجل عربيد أجل يا إخوان أجيكوا بنص البلد معكو دخان وكل من فيكو حريد احترد خد حطه ونامكو السخت امريكا عكم اعدام صدام حسين سحب اقسام حمي الدربيل بس بسمحلوش ما تشرح ليش بلاش ما انامكو السخت ام الامريكا وحلفاء الشعب الزبر كمان ووطن 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 ووطننا ووطننا وشنو الاخوان اللي خانوا شنو تقعدش تقول لي ارخم يدس لسه ليش هو مكانه تموا في كل كتاب ليش خاب تنسيطر صاح لك وحساب استنوا تقعدش تعاند يا الخويف وقعد عالساكت يرحم دموعي من عيني تنزف وتزريع على جبيني لو بعرف انك عامل اشتغل سمعتش لو خبرتيني والشعب العربي المقرف برضو على جبيني والرؤساء العرب القادة صعب بس غلبك فيزا طيني كس اخت امريكا عمل ادمان بطلنا حشيش بس عالدخان ما تسالنيش بعرفش كثير صدام حسين راجل غلبان عكم اعدام حمي الدربي العلكت في رصاصه جت في البرميل اسحب اقسام دول واعلام ما تسجل كس اخت امريكا عمل ادمان بطلنا حشيش بس عالدخان ما تسالنيش بعرفش كثير صدام حسين راجل غلبان عكم اعدام حمي الدربي العلكت في رصاصه جت في البرميل اسحب اقسام دول واعلام استنى
Good evening. Assalamu alaikum to everyone tuning in, joining us tonight. Thank you so much we appreciate your time. My name is Isra Ibrahim. I am an organizer with the South Florida Coalition for Palestine. I first want to recognize and thank the organizations that are co-sponsoring this webinar series with us tonight. We have Al-Auda South Florida. We have SJP at Florida International University. We have Hood Communist. We have Black Alliance for Peace, the South Florida Coalition. And last but not least, we have the AAPRP, which has been an incredible partner. And we want to thank them for being able to host us on their platform. Before we start, I want to restate again the purpose for this webinar series overall. The purpose of this series is to produce politically principled frameworks for serious organizers during this current historical moment in Gaza and Palestine. It's been over 100 days, and Israel, backed by the US and Europe, the colonial liberal West, has rained down 8 times the bombs on Gaza than the US did during 6 years in Iraq. We recognize in this historical moment that it has been the Islamist resistance, the Islamic struggle in the Islamic South that has been the vanguard of anti-colonial militant struggle. It is Palestine, it is Afghanistan, it is Iraq, it is Yemen. How then can we as organizers from various political ideologies, various political organizations, from a revolutionary ethic, not just come to understand the global Islamic South, but take seriously its struggle as our own? What is it about Islamic struggle that invokes such anxiety, such fear in the colonial liberal West, and continues to inspire continued resistance and struggle? It is not is it not then our responsibility as principled organizers, as serious organizers within this historical moment to engage seriously with the mass movement and organized struggle of the Islamic South? We must come to understand and accept that the calls of jihad are not calls of a regressive, terroristic monolith, but these are categorizations by the same colonial powers that terrorized and massacred various populations of the South all over. We do not play into their game. We do not accept their standard. We must struggle against that and see and come to understand that it is the mobilized jihad of the most dispossessed masses. It is the organized jihad of the poor in the Islamic South, especially in Palestine, that has formed the basis of anti-colonial struggle now. These are the ones that we hope to organize in solidarity with. These are the ones that we want to stand with. Our guest today is Dr. Tanzeen Doha. Dr. Tanzeen Doha is an anthropologist of Islam, Islamism, secularism, and race. His research explores the relationship between race and religion as categories of modern secularity, and his ethnographic meditations trace a contemporary history of tribulation within the structure of the global war on terror. He is the founder and general editor of the journal magazine Milestones commentary on the Islamic world. He is also the founder and host of the podcast Everything is Fire, the first season of which is sponsored by the International Studies at Cornell University. Thank you so much, Brother Tanzeen Doha, for joining us tonight.
Thank you, Isra.
Thank you. So taking the opening framework that we want to operate under, I think it would be really good for our audience to start with some definitions, some concepts to elaborate further and that we can utilize within our conversation tonight. I guess as a first question, how would you define Islamist resistance? What is it? What is Islamist resistance for those of us that are again witnessing the dynamic and historical moment that is in Palestine?
A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim. Bismillahir rahmanir rahim. Assalamu alaikum to all the believers who are going to see this video and are seeing this live. And I want to thank the organizations that are involved in putting this together and for inviting me. It's a great honor and privilege to be here and share my thoughts, really. And thank you, Isra, for making this connection. Your question about Islamic resistance or Islamist resistance, I think it has to be understood in several ways, but I want to first clarify or unpack what Islamic resistance as a phrase, what it does to someone who's thinking about it, particularly those who are, let's say, the radical left, broadly speaking. I want to unpack that because there are lots of assumptions that go into the question of Islamic resistance. One of the first things that's really interesting and important is that whenever there's a conversation on Islamic resistance, and you will note this when it comes to the discourse that is happening right now on the question of Palestine, is that there is often a tendency to remove the Islamic part and only talk about it as resistance. And this is a kind of secularizing what is actually happening on the ground. And this is done so it's legible to the liberal reader or the person who wants to understand it. And so Islam becomes simply an adjective or a term that is the appearance of things. So a lot of folks actually understand, they want to de-emphasize Islam and emphasize only resistance, so they don't have to actually engage with the question of Islam. And this is a form of erasure
Mm.
of
Yeah.
how resistance itself is constituted. So, for example, resistance, so in other words, Islamic or Islamist becomes an adjective, it's the appearance for something that is much more essential. This
Mm.
is a theoretical kind of conceptual problem here. So,
Yeah.
in appearance becomes Islam, but essentially they're anti-colonial. Essentially they're nationalist. Essentially they're pan-nationalist. Essentially if the reader is anarchist would think essentially they're anti-statist. Essentially they're anti-racist. Essentially they're anti-imperialist. So Islam becomes a secondary consideration. So I think
Mm.
that is not just incorrect. I think it leads to a wrong analysis and wrong understanding of something very, very historical and significant. When it comes to the question of Palestine, since the Second Intifada, the Islamic resistance and secular Palestinians also are very much in agreement about this point, which is that the Islamism in Palestine has been very, very disciplined in the way it had engaged in struggle. And of course, there
Mm.
is multiple forms of struggle within Palestine. There's no doubt about this. But we know that in Gaza, in particular, this is sort of the foundational form of organization within that space. The history of
Mm.
Islamism also has a connection with the history of the abolition of the caliphate. If you're going to be serious about that, then we
Yeah.
understand as this 20th century history in response to the abolition of the caliphate and the emergence of the nation state as a political form, and Muslims being interested and aspiring to create Islamic modes of life in this new
Mm.
situation. And Salman Sayyid, for example, the theorist of Islamism, had mentioned how the abolition of the caliphate was sort of the second crisis of Islam, first being the death of the Prophet, sallallahu alaihi wasallam.
Mm.
And so the abolition of the caliphate was this really groundbreaking situation for Muslims. They had to begin to think of themselves within particular nation states, which is really a modern formation. So I would
Mm.
leave it at that for now. And I also want to actually, there's one other point which I want to mention now that I think about it. So,
Mm.
I've noticed that with a lot of comrades on the left, that even the maximum folks would go often is they would support Islamic resistance. I mean, these are folks who are not completely blinded by like the liberals and stuff like that. But then
Yeah.
get really anxious when there are Muslims actually take power, when actually they want to create society, when they actually want to focus on their own discursive tradition and social and historical tradition, which is much bigger than the history of Europe, which is much bigger,
Mm.
which is bigger than the history of Western notions of sovereignty. So it is very
Yeah.
interesting, and it reveals a lot, the question of Islam for us, a kind of larger anxiety that really is an anxiety that is existent from the right to all the way to the left in a very
Mhm.
in various degrees. So this is something that I think is a very important question and something that we should think more.
Yeah. I think my immediate reaction to that, and what's interesting about you said is one observation I've had is, I think, let's say if you take your, basic liberal, and obviously one popular critique is that, oh, they're not able to register these Islamists as, other more than victims. Like the only way that they're able to comprehend Muslim life and Palestinian life is within their death. So they have to be victims for them to be sympathetic to and for them to understand their mode of life. And I think what tends to happen is that if we want to heighten, I guess, the political consciousness for those who are really serious about
Mhm.
solidarity with the global Islamic South, is how do we move from a view that says we only sympathize with Muslims when they're resistance fighters versus when it comes to their own self-determination. And I think that's the I guess, like, if you say, like, kind of the anxiety that arises in I think a question that I guess the litmus test it is for, I think, for serious and principled revolutionaries who really want to take this task of solidarity very seriously. I was wondering what you thought of that as well.
So the what is the question, if you don't mind, if you can? I mean,
I
I
guess
heard
that
a lot of
so
interesting
it is
points.
for the, like, I guess for the principled and serious organizer, for the revolutionary who wants to take seriously solidarity with the global Islamic South. Is it then that what they have to do is to be able to register Muslims as self-determining agents, not just as resistance fighters, but that true solidarity, true revolutionary solidarity, is registering and accepting Muslims as self-determining agents, even if it's an order that they don't necessarily agree with?
Yeah, that's a really good question because and I'm really sorry that I'm such a skeptic about so many different concepts, and I'm always kind
Yeah.
of unpacking things. So,
Hmm.
agency, for example, is a very strong term.
Hmm.
And I think Muslims, the way the Islamic discourse thinks about concepts of why people or believers would act is actually coming from a very different genealogy than the
Yeah.
genealogy of agency.
Mm.
And this is precisely why, actually, and I know we're going to be talking about, the topic is basically gender
Hmm.
and sex, and I want to bring that up because there are anthropologists who have worked, very important thinkers like Saba Mahmoud and others who talked about how um, the Western notion of agency itself is actually making certain assumptions about the Muslim subject, particularly Muslim women in this case. And you brought up the notion
Mm.
of victim. And
Yeah.
so, for example, do Muslim women choose to be part of their tradition in which there
Mm.
are specific kinds of functions that they're a part of? Do Muslim men? So, of course, there is kind of a conversation around different kinds of feminist critiques of Islam. And, of
Hmm.
course, the typical critique is this: the men are patriarchal and the women are just obedient. And this is
Yeah.
exactly, and a very kind of normative view. But there is a kind of very serious, there's two problems. One is to assume that there is absolutely everything, there's no agency. The other one is to assume that Muslims have a very clear and absolute agency over everything that they do. And we know
Mm.
that there is actually, Muslims are engaged in a discursive tradition of Islam in which there is
Hmm.
divine will, divine power, and divine
Yeah.
law. And they're also being very seriously restricted by historical determinations. And
Mm.
those things are not in our control. That's precisely the oppressive structures of society, particularly
Mm.
society. So it's a kind of a dialectic in that sense, that
Yeah.
it's not this 100% agency and there's not this 100% complete control. And
Hmm.
because Islamists do believe in a divine order, because they're inspired by a different kind of power, they're also not only thinking of themselves as historical products. So I think it is in that space where we have to think about, why do Muslims act, and why do the Islamists in Gaza act, and what inspires them, and why do they do that? What is the structure of desire in terms of their political desire? Is it simply the result of settler colonialism, or is there a kind of another kind of interest to have that kind of a fight against settlers and settler citizens and so on, and the state, of course?
Yeah. So I want to gears just a little bit back onto this phrasing of Islamism and then Islamic struggle, Islamist resistance. And I want to introduce the war on terror here, because I think for us to really understand and deconstruct, I guess, the fear and the anxiety that even that phrasing invokes, I think it's really pertinent that we understand what is its relation with the war on terror and how the war on terror operates um, in relation to Islamism and Islamist struggle. So how would you respond to that? What is this war? What is a war on terror? What is a war against terror? And how does Islamism register into that?
That's a good question. And I think we have to be historical about a few things. First, the question of terror, that has a very specific genealogy, all the way back to the French Revolution and back to the Haitian Revolution. And the kind of framing that took place from that era. But the war on terror specifically that we're thinking of since 9/11 is a specific global war against Islamism of a very specific. Mahmoud Mamdani talked about the good Muslim and the bad Muslim, and therefore the bad Muslims are those Muslims who are actually going to stand up to Western intervention and Western forms of domination, and of course capitalism, of course colonialism, and so on. What Malcolm would have called the white power structure. So when Islamists have fought against Western interventions of various forms, and then after 9/11 and the failure at the level of security and intelligence that happened in the West, and the war that took place was basically a war that was specifically designed against Islam. And my claim is that it's not against and then so it had very kind of serious forms of ideological structures as well. But largely, I go with Erland Bush Anderson's idea that the war on terror could be best understood as a mechanism for the social defense of the West. So it's basically Islam actually is considered a threat that disrupts Western notion of society, the Western notion of the political. And so Islamism, or the Islamist, is the terrorist par excellence, so to speak. And so that's against whom the war is. And of course, we can do, one thing and I'm actually working on a special issue right now, which kind of deals with this question, is that in sort of the radical left discourse, much of it is very, very important. All of it is very important, of course, but there are things that we need to add when we're thinking about the question of Islam, is that the war on terror is always conceptualized in leftist discourse, or even sort of liberal discourse, as a consequence of something else. So the war on terror is a consequence of imperialism. War on terror is a consequence, is a product of colonialism. So war on terror is a consequence of capitalist accumulation through dispossession. So all of those different kind of theorizations are really important, but I am not 100% sure that the war on terror could be completely reduced as to that consequence. I think war on terror has to be understood as a war, which is on ideas of what is the figure of the terrorist and which figure is it in the last 20 plus years. And when we do that, then we have to go towards understanding why Islamism is thought of as the main antagonism to Western expansion. Why is that the case? So I think in terms of the mechanism for social defense, the thing that the West wants to preserve, all right, the idea of the Western state, the idea of the modern state, the idea of the current economic structure, all of those things are fundamentally part of the war on terror. But the war on terror is also against this specific kind of figure. And having said that, though, I would want to expand and say that other forms of other kinds of communities that are in antagonism with the West, after the beginning of the war on terror, would become sort of targets who are in proximity to Muslims. So this is another.
So what would be an example of that?
A clear example would be, when during Trump's era, he had identified some of the radical protesters in Black struggle as Black identity extremists. That came out directly from counterterrorism discourse, right? So, and of course, we can go back further and look at the history of the counterterrorism, which also was there prior to the beginning of the formal war on terror in 9/11. And then we can keep going further back. And so that would be the genealogical approach to understand it. But at the present moment, it's really kind of important to understand how the enemy is constructed. So in that sense, if we look at the history of the enemy, then we would know that Europe considered Muslims to be the external enemy. So in order to even think of its own politicality, it had to construct this enemy, had to deal with this enemy. And so it's constitutive for Europe to even have a political orientation. It would need this figure of the terrorist, who is Muslim. And this is something that, a scholar named Gil Anajar talks about in the history of the enemy, where he's kind of identifying the figure of the Jew and the figure of the Muslim as internal and external enemies of Europe. And so the figure of the Semite basically becomes really integral to Europe, for Europe to even define itself. And so this is foundational to, so this is another reason why the question of Islam is so important, because if it's not understood, then we don't actually understand how Europe thinks about its own political formation. It
I
cannot
appreciate
form
the
by itself
sorry
without this.
to cut you off, but I think my immediate reaction, I appreciate the contrast you made between the good and bad Muslim, especially when you define the war on terror as like a social defense of the West. And I think this is really important because if you, I think within the past couple of months, if you look online, you see Israeli settlers, Israeli leaders, and Western leaders, for example, praise certain quote unquote Islamic or Arab governments for being good Muslims. Like the government of Saudi Arabia, for example, was been praised like almost immediately by key figures within the Israeli government, within the American government, about how they've been able to be a part of like a new modernity, be part of this wider civilization. So I think it's also for us to understand that when we talk about the figure of the terrorist, it's not about whether he's Muslim or not, but it is about very in fact it's about what kind of Muslim and what kind of Muslim this figure poses, what kind of threat they pose to the West as like as empire, as expansion. So I think that is really, I think, critical for many of us to really take seriously and understand really well. Um, so yeah, that's really interesting you how you make that connection. I want to introduce the concept of gender here. And it connects to the war on terror. When we talk about the war on terror, I think it's very important we talk about, obviously, the political side of Palestine, but it makes sense that we draw like connections to also Iraq, Guantanamo Bay, like the figure of the Muslim man, especially the Islamist man that has been a key figure in resistance and quote unquote terrorism against the West. Um, what I want to ask is, the past few months, you've seen that the Israeli state, you've seen colonial propaganda utilize rape claims against the Islamist resistance, for example, in Gaza, that during their attack, that they had raped multiple women and whatnot, and basically kind of constructing this image of the misogynistic, the rapist Muslim bearded man. And it's interesting that that's always brought up because it's not enough for a white woman to be murdered. She always has to be mutilated or raped by either like a brown or black, figure. And at the same time that this is occurring, you're also seeing videos being released by Israeli soldiers completely emasculating Palestinian men for all the world to see, stripping them naked, having them perform really humiliating, uh, yeah, just very humiliating acts. I want to ask for what's your reaction to this, and how does this disrupt how we usually think of gendered violence, especially when it comes to sites in the global Islamic South?
That's a really long question.
Yeah, go
Uh,
ahead, take it like piece by piece.
yeah, I mean, before you got onto that question, I wanted to just say one more short thing about you said, and I think you were kind of summarizing what I had said earlier about Islamists and Muslims. One of the things that Said Qutb and others who were really critical in theorizing what Islamayun was, what Islamism is, when they were in Egyptian prisons, was that they said that the Muslims are asleep, but the Muslims who are awake are the ones who are going to stand up to Firaun. And those Muslims who are awake and who are going to act and are not going to take Pharaoh's violence are the ones who are Islamists. And so that's precisely the Muslims against whom the war on terror is organized. Having said that, it is a targeting of not just Muslims as people, it's a targeting also of a tradition, which is the discursive, normative tradition of Islam. And this is precisely why I always say, and I use this phrase, that Islam cannot be de-essentialized, which means the way to de-essentialize Islam, and unfortunately, Western feminists have engaged in this, is to basically make Islam's own corpus less important to construct the political will of Muslims. Whenever we do that, we're actually trying to participate or are being complicit in the disarticulation of Islam, what I call the de-essentialization of Islam. So this is a very important dimension at the level of political discourse. So this is why we cannot secularize how Islamists have thought about the status of the world, how they have thought about what militancy means, how they've thought about what does it mean to fight and how, and through what resources. And I mean here textual things, right? Conceptual things. What is the conceptual apparatus that will be used in the struggle against Western domination? And I think, so the real target is actually Islam's own corpus, having this kind of structure in which the Sharia is really central in defining Muslim life, and which includes, of course, pages and pages of our classical texts talking about how to retaliate and exactly why, the procedure, etc., etc. So once those things are kind of made less serious, then you get the watered down version of Islam, which is more acceptable within secular life.
So
And
that's why also when you talk about Islamist resistance, it's the resistance that's emphasized and the Islam that's de-essentialized, basically.
precisely. So when people talk about resistance and they remove Islam, they're actually working against the resistance, because they're actually removing and erasing the conceptual apparatus responsible for organizing those societies from the very ground up. Everything from what is kinship, what is brotherhood, what is sisterhood, how do we think about families, what are different forms of marriages that Islam has, right? So polygyny, why is that important? What is the reproductive structure of the society in Gaza? These are all actually questions related to Islam. So once we erase Islam, we're actually working against resistance, because the question of resistance when it comes to Islam is not is not actually separated from, it's not an alienated form of resistance in which resistance is just a political act. It's actually a much more, it's a totality in which this resistance happens, in which men, women, children, elderly, everybody participates, because they do have a particular kind of orientation within the modality of Islam. And that is very, very significant. So this is why it cannot be, in other words, Islam cannot be reduced. Islam cannot be kind of, subtract the religion, keep the politics, remove the society, but keep the militant, those kinds of operations. Those are secular operations against Islamic struggle. And I think this is very, very an important point. So let's go to the other questions that you had. And I think, do you mind repeating like at least the first part so I can go back to that?
No, yes, definitely. And again, I just wanted to restate and echo what you just said, because I think what's happening, especially with the amount of content and videos we've seen from Gaza, you've seen this resurgence and interest in what people are saying, and even the concept of like martyrdom, like where that comes from, and why is it important for this population, and actually why that kind of like formation has been able to make them adequate to resisting the violence, the utter um, destruction that is aimed at them. So I think that's really, really critically important. Just to restate, it was a question of how do we think about gendered violence when it comes to the Islamic South? Again, just to kind of draw some parallels. Um, we've seen the past couple of months the Israeli government utilizing rape claims against Muslim Islamist men that are engaging in acts of political resistance. Because again, it's not enough, like we said, for a colonizing woman or like a white woman to be murdered and mutilated. She has to be raped to evoke a kind of image of this patriarchal terrorist man that's like unable to be dealt with. um and we have that happening like all over the New York Times and the liberal propaganda, and at the same time you're actually seeing videos and content of Israeli soldiers literally being so gleeful and happy. Literally they're laughing and smiling and while they're literally stripping down Palestinian men naked on like in the street, and
Yeah.
and just complete like emasculation of these Muslim men. And it's so interesting, like even though we register and understand this, there is no the outcry can't even be comparable. It's almost laughable. It would be laughable if it wasn't so sad, just how stark the comparisons like literally have been. So I want to ask you, like, how should we think of gendered violence when it comes to
Yeah.
understanding violence, specifically violence in Palestine, in Iraq, Guantanamo Bay, and within the Islamic South? How should we approach this?
Yeah. Yeah. I think okay, actually that's related to what I said earlier, so I didn't waste my waste your time. The question of targeting Muslims and gendering the kind of violence that's taking place. On one hand, trying to look for, and I want to first really make it very, very clear, and I'm sure this program has the kind of audience who are very, very smart, and they know this already, and they're completely understanding and in agreement with me that there hasn't been any credible record at all so far of the Palestinian resistance and the resistance from Gaza and the Islamists engaging in sexual violence against the Israelis. We don't have any of that at this point from what we saw. The New York Times, of course, published that report, which was completely flawed, and there's various commentators, including I think one from Was it Jadaliya or somewhere, or Max Blumenthal, whoever? So there was even like left liberal media have completely discredited those reports, even though there is parts of the left, like I guess if you consider them the left, The Nation, for example, has published horrible piece against full of lies against Hamas. So first, let's completely say that this stuff, there is no credibility, and I think the charge against first of all, the two charges. One, on one hand, the charge against Palestinian men as potentially um, um, being violent at that level of the sexual. I have to go back to Malcolm when he said that the white power structure is actually working out there is a white guilt that is revealing itself when it thinks that the enemy is going to do what whites have done to others. And I think in this case, this is such clear example. There's like hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of records from anthropologists, historians, empirical studies on what the IDF has done with the bodies of Palestinians, mutilations, sexual assaults, violence, bombing, all of that. There's like, the evidence is so clear, right? So there is so at the level of the psychic, the psychosexual structure, there is something happening there where there's this constant fear that the Muslims are coming, and these Muslim men, if they come, what are they going to do to our women, etc. And it is very interesting that there's so many reports of, and this is another reason why someone should look at the question of the history of Islamism, is that there's actually laws of how to conduct yourself in a situation of war. And so as a result, it is very interesting. The struggle should be assessed from within the discourse of Islam itself. If there are some errors, some mistakes by a few of the militants and so on, those things are actually being talked about within the Islamic discourse. I've had many conversations like that in which Islamic thinkers have engaged in conversation about how to think about these questions from within our own discourse. That's number one. So we don't have to always rely on the Western human rights discourse to understand everything about violence, right? That's already playing the game according to their viewpoint. The second point is this kind of exhibition, the humiliation that started in the war on terror. This is why the question of the war on Gaza is also a war. It's also war on terror. A part of the perpetual war on terror is not only settler colonialism, because this idea of targeting bodies of those who is ideologically constructed as the terrorist and so on has to be attacked and humiliated in this way. So those who are citizens in a settler state can have their mode of life. So this is very, very important. So the political humiliation and the political death of Islamists and terrorists are basically objectively necessary for the continued social life of those who the Israelis consider humans, which is themselves. So you have to then kill off those who are not considered human, or those who, according to Israeli politicians, are labeled as human animals or barbaric and so on. We know where that discourse comes from.
Or that all of Gaza is Hamas and Hamas is Gaza. There's like this.
Okay, and so what?
Yeah.
And so this is the structure, the paradoxical structure and nature of how Islam is targeted, and there's an attempt to discipline Islam's own discourse, and this is very, very important for us to understand where that comes from. So again, the question, I think you have other questions, I'm sure, about the notion of gender, but I do want to go back to this idea of innocence, right? The idea of innocence. There's anthropological work done I do think that we need to question innocence as a concept. Innocence does not help us very much. So, because the Israeli state or any state that is aggressive towards large groups of populations, or there is a mechanism of social defense happening, and there is a targeted group, and in this case is Islam, in this case is Gaza. Israelis know, they continuously say that the women and children are human shields. Actually, what they know is that the women and children in Gaza are part of the society in Gaza that has to reproduce itself, and it cannot reproduce itself without our future. It cannot reproduce itself without the women being part of that society. So that society will not reproduce itself just by men. So women and children, the Israelis never think of them as innocent, etc., etc. So innocence is always for the Israeli citizens who are settlers. That's a term for Israeli citizens. That's a term for, in Western racial grammar or racial economy, that's sort of like preserved for white women. White women were considered innocent. So if someone, you looked at a white woman the wrong way, one would want, particularly a man of color, particularly a black man, he would be lynched. And that's the structure of what innocence does. So, this whole innocence and all of that, we need to not worry about that question that much. And Israelis are also, here's a statistic that is very clear, and from your own sentences, earlier statements, where you compared like the amount of bombing that the US has done on Afghanistan and Iraq, and then the intensity of bombing that happened on Gaza by the Israelis. The Israelis do not even have a kind of, the fake Western feminism of protecting the brown woman from the brown man as the white man. They don't even
I was just wanted to say, like,
Yeah.
you see no human rights Western discourse. That's historically what's happened, especially when it comes to this region, that we even in Algeria as well, that we have to save the woman, the veiled woman. We have to save
Right.
them from their men. But you see, this is almost non-existent
That's
when it
correct.
comes to Palestine. Like the women are like you said, like it seems like gender and age and whatnot just completely disappears when it comes to the
That's
Palestinian
right.
cause.
That's right. There is a kind of I'm using Spiller's term here to an extent, kind of ungendering at that level, where it's like the Gazans have to be destroyed. There's like a death camp, basically. It has to be destroyed, particularly the women and children, because they're the ones who are going to be reconstructing this society. They're the ones who celebrate the martyrdom of the fighters. They're the ones who continuously state that without our resistance fighters, we wouldn't have honor. They're the ones who are actually creating the world that allows for the possibility of resistance. So this is very, very important. And they're also realizing, this is why another dimension of Islam, that the Islamic modality allows for that kind of reproducibility of that society. That's the dominant form of life. And even the non-Muslims in Gaza know this, and they're part of the Islamicate, to use Hodgson's term, that you could have non-Muslims in an Islamicate world, very much consistent with the Islamic modality and understanding. This is why you haven't heard Palestinian Christians complaining anything. They love the resistance. They love the resistance. Only the secular left in the West are worried about, what's going to really happen. They actually have, at the level of unconscious, they also have a kind of anxiety, which they have to actually kind of think through. This is kind of a self-deconstruction that needs to take place. So, and again, because of the amount of death we have seen, the evidence in front of us of the way women and children are killed at a much higher rate we saw, it's clear that there is no, Israelis don't care about this kind of saving the women from the They're actually more interested in making sure that the Palestinian society cannot reproduce itself. They're really interested in this whole notion of the final solution, basically. And of course, they're going to fail, because one of the reasons why they're acting out like this is because they got slapped in front of the whole world, in front of history itself. And their entire apparatus failed. Their intelligence apparatus failed. Their security apparatus failed. All of that failed. So they don't know what to do. And so as a result, this is a desperate attempt, and they keep on failing, which is, if you're, I might sound like I'm being passionate. I'm just being objective, really. I'm just giving empirical facts, which is, if you're understanding political theory and you understand war, you're seeing basically the victory of a guerrilla war attempt against settlers, against colonialism, right? And so this is a very important point, that Israel is losing the war at multiple levels, at the level of ideology, at the level of militarily, actually, because the resistance continues to happen, at the level of propaganda, they've lost it, at the level of even civil society, public opinion, they've lost it. So this is a very serious moment. It's a historical moment, and all praise to the martyrs who gave their lives, and the Palestinians who are doing this at a very serious price with very little help from the rest of the world.
Yes. No, definitely. May Allah definitely reward them. And I would like to say, especially when you talk about the Israeli apparatus and at the level of even like Israeli society, you see that despite the intensity of the bombing, that they are the ones with the heightened level of anxiety and fear.
Right.
I forgot what her name was, but it's a famous Israeli psychotherapist that talked about Gazan society, the creation of like sociopaths. And they're very comfortable talking about this, like very out loud, because they know that they have a direct confrontation with the people that they are like bombing. Like, subhanAllah, when you see how direct it is, the violence just bears itself naked completely.
That's correct. That's right. And if you one of the hostages, and to go back to the point of the rape fantasy of the white man, is when it comes to black men, and in this instance Muslim men and men who are considered terrorists par excellence, is that one of the hostages, Israel is going around trying to find anyone who would say I was raped. They're really trying to find it, right? And they can't find it. They're like doing all kinds of investigations. Their own people are denying it. They're like, man, we can't find it, right? So they found this one hostage, and she was saying, and the Israelis keep on sharing this. She was saying that and the interviewer asked, so what happened? I mean, were you raped? And they were like, no, I wasn't, but I could have been. See, this is the whole point. That's the whole point of where the thinking is, right? That the idea of you could have been, and that is actually drilled. That's part of the unconscious. That's the thinking. That's the white guilt complex that the settlers have, that you have to constantly, because they're always looking over their shoulder, trying to find the exact kind of violent being that they themselves have been to the Palestinians. And we have to actually understand this kind of libidinal psychosexual structure. Well, Fanon talked about the psychosexual structure of colonialism. It's very much part of the mentality that gets reproduced. Yeah.
No, thank you for that. And to just bring it back a little bit to, again, this question of gender, I think it's really important that in this moment, while we're seeing honestly, like the bare and heroic masculinity of Palestinian men, of Muslim men in this right now, you see Muslim men literally carrying people under the rubble with their bare hands. You see them fasting so women and children can eat and drink first. I mean, this is the kind of masculinity that is reproduced in the Gazan society that has made itself adequate to defeating settler colonialism, to defeating the war on terror, and they're not losing hope. They're just continuing and continuing. And it's that level of fear and anxiety that invokes within the West. Like, why do these people just keep on going? And why do they keep on invoking Allah or jihad and all these things that, cause them at the very basic fundamental level, like this extreme anxiety.
Yeah.
And so I wanted to ask you for like maybe like a short historical account of why is it that the type of masculinity that is produced by Islamism adequate to defeating and has been adequate to defeating the violence and the intensity that we've been seeing? Where does this come from historically and showing itself within this moment?
Yeah, that's a very deep question. Where does it come from? I mean, of course, when we're thinking about the question, I mean, first of all, I'll take two different routes. One is Fanon, because I think given our audience, I don't want to talk about a tradition that they may not know everything about, right? So the Islamic tradition has very particular concepts of how to think about the question of gender and sex and ethics and ethical relations and kinship and so on. But one of the things that when we go to the first chapter on violence, one of the original kind of liberal feminist kind of attack on Fanon was that when Fanon was talking about violence, it sounded too masculine or something, right? This kind of militancy of the colonized. So there is already the idea of but for Fanon, it's not simply about agency. It's actually the inevitability of violence for the complete dismantling of the colonial structure. This is an inevitability. This is where there's no other option. This is when the way any society would change is a kind of violent disorder in the present status quo. So that is basically at the level of settler colonialism. That's something we need to get, obviously. But remember, Fanon was also talking about an Islamic society. He was talking about Algeria, massive populations, deeply influenced by the history of Islam. And Fanon had shortcomings in understanding that. And therefore, his work did not have that component in it. It was not as robust in that element of it, right? But we can see it in the footnotes. We can see how he's thinking through where these ideas came from. When Fanon talks about the Algerian couple, for example, how do they think about their militancy against the French, right? Those are very, very important. When Fanon is thinking about the elderly, the Fanon is thinking about the Algerian boy who wants to fight against the French teenager in school or something, right? And those are all kind of coming up for Fanon only as historical formations. But if you're actually fluent in the Islamic tradition, we know that those things are also coming from the discourse of Islam. And so this is where it's very, very important to understand that there may not, a materialist analysis may not always give us the complete picture of why a particular group would react slightly differently than another particular group, and they're almost under the same conditions. Very important point that someone needs to understand. I'll give you an example. It's a personal kind of story. Right after 9/11, I went to an event. It was in San Francisco. These like really important leftists were talking. Like I'm talking about the Weather Underground, like the real who played a very serious role against the state and stuff. But anyway, there was another Marxist theorist there whose name I won't mention because I don't want to just do kind of name calling or anything like that. But very important, very established Marxist, a person of color, was a very important senior scholar. He was there. So after the talk, I went and spoke to him, and I wanted to find out more about the question of Islam. And he didn't attack me, but he was kind of critical. And his response, he told me something, and we had an exchange, and I still remember that exchange. And at that point, the war on terror, the war in Afghanistan and Iraq just started. It's been like 2-3 years, 4 years maybe, right? And he said, listen, look, you're interested in this Islam stuff, you want to know more about this, but let me just tell you that the people of Indochina have suffered a lot more in American interference and interventions, Western interventions, than the Muslims you're talking about, you know? But how come these Muslims in Iraq and Afghanistan are engaging in this terrorist violence and resistance against them? How come? So then there is something. So I actually asked him that question. I asked him the same question, but I asked him in a different language. I said, well, doesn't that show that there is a particular modality of life which doesn't allow for certain kinds of violations, and people are going to respond? There's always going to be that Muslim who's not going to actually take it. They're actually going to go all the way. They're actually going to cross the borders and mess up your concert.
The one that will stand up to Firaun.
So that's the point. So then if we have two groups of people and materialist analysis, right? I am interested in materialist analysis because we do have to understand social relations, right? The way society is formed. So but materialist analysis is not telling us why a particular circumstance is not producing or is producing more resistance from a different set of circumstance, but the conditions are quite similar, comparatively speaking. And I think this is where the question of Islam has to be taken seriously. This is where the modality of life has to be taken seriously, right? It's not a surprise that the first recorded history of in the Western Hemisphere of a slave revolt was led by a Muslim. Those are not surprising facts for those of us who are kind of clear about the history of jihad in Western Hemisphere. This is very, very important to know. And I would place it there, this question, right? I don't know. Now I kind of lost track a little bit. Apologies for that, but
No, that's good.
ask more questions.
No, it's good that connection about, like, again, where it comes from. Do you have, what would you say specifically for, I guess, specifically the masculinity of the Islamist resistance in Gaza?
Yeah.
I think specifically to the context of the Qassam brigades, of
Yeah,
that kind of
I actually
history.
want to, yeah. So, the Qassam Brigades was named after Izzeldin Qassam, who conducted some of the earliest raids and militant attacks against for the British Mandate and then the Israelis, and so that remained, he comes from a Sufi order of Assyrian origin, and at Milestones we're trying to find text, if we can find text in Arabic and so on, and trying to translate them to kind of get a better sense of his world and how he was thinking. But one of the things I've noticed from just I wouldn't call it rigorous yet, but some basic research that Izzeldin Qassam was of the idea that the peasantry has to be organized and the most dispossessed has to be organized through Islamic teachings. And and one of the terms he used, which is he didn't use this term, but in describing him, they talked about the inevitability of jihad in Islam, which is to me very similar to the inevitability of violence that Fanon talks about. That if you are a serious Muslim, by that I mean those who are serious about being targeted and that you are considered an enemy and you have to stand up and fight back. So those kinds of Muslims, at some point, there will be the inevitability of jihad. Everything you do will have a particular kind of interest to aspiration to use the Islamic discourse for the purposes of fighting back. And I think that inevitability of jihad that Izzeldin Qassam talked about actually comes from his view, which is a total view of Islam, not disarticulating Islam into separate categories, the social part, the personal part, or the political part, but everything is integrated in Islam. And so you would have to live your life according to the divine sort of will and law and notion of power. And once you do that, you have a total sense of how to engage in society and what would be your function. So the question of the inevitability of jihad, there is a Sharia on how to fight and certain responsibilities that in the normative tradition men would have. Those responsibilities require men to stand up when certain kinds of oppressive structures are in place. We know from the Quran and the Hadith what the responsibilities and obligations are. So in Islam, there's obligations. It's not simply a choice. There's an obligation to do certain things. And one of the primary thing is that in the Islamic tradition, as you know, Isra, is that struggle is a form of worship. To be engaged in struggle, it's not just a political goal. You have to struggle. You have to engage in struggle. That's just foundational for the continuation of your life. And this is why the question of martyrdom is so important in Islam. And this is why the Palestinian mothers who lose their sons in battle are so proud of their sons, is because they realize that their destination is with Allah. And this is, of course, I mean, secular audience might find this strange, but I'm just explaining the tradition, which is that this is kind of the tradition. So that tradition provides very specific sets of roles and functions and things within the condition of war that one would have to engage in. And this includes what the women would do and what the children would do and how they would be organized in a society and how to try to protect them, protect themselves, and how to maintain that society, how to have a society that could be sustained. And I think that's sort of an imperative of Islam, the Islamic discourse. So yes, I mean, so once a person is raised in that tradition, then they have to look at what their obligations are, what is recommended acts, right? What are the things that they could do? What is the flexibility? What are the limitations? And one would create themselves one would become a subject according to that discourse and not according to the discourse of the settler. And so that is very, very important. So the idea of masculinity is a very distinct idea within Islamic discourse. It's a prophetic. You're emulating the prophet who had all of these different dimensions in his life as a political leader, as a leader, as someone who leads his family. And then you have to look at his wives, and you have to look at his other family members, his companions. So there is a way in which a world is envisioned and thought through. And you have that discourse, and then you have the modern historical kind of antagonism in which you find yourself. So then you have to think about the inevitability of violence and the inevitability of jihad. And in the Quran, it says very clearly that sometimes you may hate fighting, but you're obligated to fight. You're obligated to fight. You may hate fighting, but you're obligated to fight. That's a different kind of obligation. It's not obligation from some father figure. It's an abstraction, the creator, but it's an abstraction. It doesn't come to the world as the father. It's an abstraction. It's the creator. Makes us obligated to fight. And so, the stronger, when you see injustice, as there's a hadith, and you know this very clearly, I'm sure, that when you see injustice, you have to, at the best, the one with the best faith, the strongest faith is someone who fights against that injustice with his hands. And then the one who sort of stands up and uses his voice against it. And the third is the one who has weak faith, who basically only hates the injustice in his heart or her heart, and they can't do anything with it against it. And so, these are not simply a judgment, a moral judgment on Muslims, but these are the flexibility of Islam as well, that you could find yourself in different situations where you may not be able to use your hands, right? If you're in Guantanamo Bay prison, right? So how would you, so those are different, it's a very robust tradition, is all I would say. And as an anthropologist who studies these things, there's a lot of work that are being done by very important people and scholars, and it needs to be taken seriously.
Yeah, no, no, thank you so much for, bringing that perspective, because I think that for like serious, interested people who want to take the Islamic South seriously and what's happening, we have to contend and understand what their mode of life is.
Yeah.
And this includes understanding what jihad is and what we view as um, like as obligation and why we act the way that we do. This is, very basic things that I think as a introduction needs to be understand. Um, and what I really liked, I kind of want to bring a little bit of not a class element, but I guess so. But really, when we understand jihad, that really people understand that if you understand the mode of life of the global Islamic South, Islamism really is at the heart of like the most dispossessed of the masses, um, not just in the Islamic South, but particularly I would say in Gaza. And I think there's an interesting kind of relationship there about, being of the of dispossession, of a class element, and why Islamism is a popular political will of so many, I think, so many like of, of the Muslim masses throughout the Islamic South. What's your reaction to that?
I mean, yeah, if you're interested in knowing the mode of life of the underclass, why does the underclass in different societies in Muslim majority countries adhere to a notion of Islamism when they have to stand up politically? And the underclass finds it necessary to continue to have some degree of aspiration, right? To have some degrees, to have that kind of militancy. They take refuge in Islam. They don't take refuge in other formations as much, and this has consistently been the case. And it's very important to, so even if you're interested in the class question, right, you would have to be interested in the question of the religion of the underclass, let's say. And that's kind of the religion of the most dispossessed, the religion of the damned, of the wretched. And I think it would be actually a place that one would have to focus on quite a bit to understand how people are thinking about in terms of solutions for the conditions that they find themselves in, the historical conditions that they find themselves in. And I want to also be very, very clear that within Palestine, especially at this moment, it's so united. Like they understand the Palestinian, even the secular friends in Palestine and other organizations are very, very understanding about the unity that exists within these various formations. And they're also very clear that at this point, the Islamists are playing a very, very critical and leading role in their struggle, and everyone respects that, right? How this becomes, later on in history, how the consolidations work and so on, that's a different question of hegemony and power and other things. And, I have to be genealogical about this, and I'll stay very close to listening to the ground in a way. We all should be. And I think that's the question. Izzeldin Qassam is a very interesting example because he was interested in that kind of peasantry and the underclass and the people who were kind of the most dominated in that society and organizing them against these settler checkpoints and things like that. And that is a very important figure to study. And I think those figures exist in Islamism. Much of Islamism has that, right? So, and I would say one thing, that there is actually a misunderstanding sometimes in well-meaning Marxist discourse about that Islamists are ultimately end up being liberals or something. I don't know where that comes from, but I've had that I've had that response from a few in conversations that they think because they don't have a social critique like the Marxists do in the same language, that they probably will slip back into some kind of liberal model of governance or something like that. I think that's just misinformation. Maybe they're not aware of the vast discourse of Islam. And I think this is why there needs to be more research done on various forms, various formations of Islamic struggle, including the ones in the Western Hemisphere, right? If you're thinking about, the movements that Malcolm participated in, not just the two overground organizations, but also the underground organization for which he was the advisor, international advisor. Why were the militant youth interested in the question of Islam to this day in the most struggling parts of specific neighborhoods? Islam is much more attractive as a form of religion and as a mode of life. And I think this is important to understand both in the Western Hemisphere as well as what is called Islamic non-West or the global South and so on.
No, thank you so much for that. I have one last question before we enter into our Q&A. For serious organizers, for principled organizers, why do you feel it's important that they learn about Islam and Islamism? I mean, I think we kind of touched on a lot, but what would be like, I guess, like a good
I just
simple.
touched it. I think
Yeah.
I mean we need to study struggles and
Yeah.
and Islamic struggles have a very serious and long history and trajectory. And regardless of our religious orientation, if there is an interest to know how specific radical movements have taken shape in modern history, one would have to pay attention to Islam, and particularly Islamic movements and Islamism, what is called Islamism sometimes. Yeah.
And with that, thank you so much. We will now be entering our Q&A with Dr. Tanzeen Doha. If you have any questions, please submit them in the Q&A question function. So one question that an audience member has is, can you speak more on the genealogy of the concept of terrorism, specifically as it relates to the Haitian Revolution and other national liberation struggles?
Yeah, I mean, I can refer a book which the the listener will have to read. But let me put it this way: there is a book called Genealogies of Terrorism by Verena Erlenbush Anderson, which is a study of this term and where it emerged from. But unfortunately, she doesn't focus that much on the Haitian Revolution. And I think in my work, because I think about race and religion together, I try to think about the figure of the terrorist in relation to figure of the way the figure of the Muslim is configured, and the way the slave uprisings were configured. So the idea of slave uprisings, burning down plantations, those were considered terrorist acts, and there is a history of that. There's also a history of in the genealogy of terrorism. There is a history of course, the French Revolution and the idea of having a kind of republic and that whole history as well. And then there's also a history of state terrorism, a genealogy of state terrorism, and a particular way of kind of thinking about, in a biased way, about like the Soviet Union and other forms that emerged. There was a targeting of those forms of states. And so there's a genealogy of that as well. And I think I really encourage the listeners to take a look at that book. I can post the link or something if you want. But I am personally interested in thinking about the figure of the slave and the figure of the terrorist, and how there's actually a kind of connection in those figures. And this is why it's very, very interesting to see Western Hemisphere and slave uprisings in which Islam was really very, very uh, 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 serious in creating a kind of space for organizing. One of the reasons is because of the way, and now I guess I'm talking about the Western discourse, but the history of slavery in the West, which is to think about how Islam gave a language um, to those who were enslaved because of the cultural genocide that took place. So, because of the ability to um, um, think through the language of Arabic and so on, there was a kind of possibility for an interaction amongst those who were enslaved. And so a lot of formations, early formations, took its inspiration from, Islam. Even if you think about someone like Bookman, in the Haitian Revolution, the idea of the, man of book, the Bookman was, he was reading a book and it was the Quran. And that's one of the stories that goes in that. So I think we need to think about those questions very, very seriously. And I think the idea of the slave who's burning down plantations is, as the figure of the terrorist, is an important place of investigation.
Thank you for that. There were a couple of questions that asked for serious recommendations on self-education on Islam, um, and also texts to learn more about, I think, not just Islamic resistance, but specifically about Al-Qassam as well. If you have any recommendations for our audience,
I was,
to
most of the stuff on Izzuddin al-Qassam is in Arabic, and I would encourage, I don't want to self-promote, but in Milestones, we're going to be probably publishing certain things about that history, and we're trying to see if we can find folks to translate more materials. A lot of the materials are in Arabic, so it needs to be translated for English readers. The other question was about Islam. I think maybe they're asking about Islamism because that's what we talked about a lot, but I really think,
yeah, as applicable to these contexts.
yeah, exactly. So, I would think like the text or the works of Said Qutb, the works of Hassan al-Banna, and the works of Maulana Maududi are central to understanding Islamism. There's actually yeah, there you go. There is a Princeton readings of Islamism, I think 20th century, which has it's like an anthology or something, which has some of the highlights of 20th century Islamist thought. And I think that would be pretty interesting, a pretty good starting point. It has actual works by the thinkers themselves.
So there is an interesting question about settler masculinity. So the question is, in the event that Palestine is decolonized and the settler population is integrated into Palestinian society, what do you believe would be the most progressive approach to de-radicalization from Zionism, particularly when approaching the settler masculinity?
Mm. That's a very good question. I mean, the answer for me might be too obvious, but I will say this, instead of giving like a moralistic gesture, I think if we look at the different histories of that region under different forms of governance, systems of governance, we'll find out that the time in which there was actual peace was when there was a governance that was based on the Islamic discourse, which did not allow for, vile forms of violence and horrible forms of, like IDF probably has a sense of masculinity, which is bullshit. You know what I mean? So that's not, it has no values, it has no understanding, it's brutal. And so that's nothing to do with Islam. Islamic understanding and the kind of kindness and care that goes into thinking about emulating and the prophets, it's really significant and important. And I think that would be important, key. And I should say Islamic hate to an extent, because Palestine is also a very multi religious society, and historically so. And so we'd have to think about the histories of that region and in what time there was actual peace, and that would be a great source. And I think when we do go there, you would probably have similar solution as me, actually. Even through a materialist understanding, you would probably come to the conclusion that in this region, the Islamic horizon probably would bring a relatively smooth kind of society, a transition from this colonized settler.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's very important. How can those of us that are in the movement and are not Muslim and not Palestinian push back against these Islamophobic ideas without feeling like we are speaking for our Muslim brothers and sisters?
That's an interesting question. I don't know. I want to know what's at stake there, because I'm not Palestinian, so someone could say, "You're not Palestinian. Why are you talking about Gaza?" We sometimes get charged by these things. So I think it's a very generative question, because this person wants to know, how can we do the work without like speaking for something. I am way more. I don't think we should have this problem of worrying so much. I think as long as we speak what's correct, the analysis has to be correct. That's what's important than whether someone is offended or something for civil society morality or something like that. I think if the analysis is correct, I respect it. And I actually don't, at that level, I don't care who you are. What I care about is the analysis right? Is it going towards the truth? Is it actually connected to the actual conditions on the ground, the social conditions on the ground, right? Is it taking the modality of life seriously? And I think once we do that, it doesn't matter who says that. To an extent, it doesn't matter. To a large extent.
Yeah. And I would just add, our prior conversation as well, there are Muslims and there are Islamists. And then we also have to be kind of particular of when we say, speaking for Muslim brothers and sisters, we have to also be, specific about what kind of Muslims we're speaking about. I mean, like Tanzeen said, I mean, there you can find many examples of Muslims that are, I guess, anti, the popular resistance, in Gaza, the Islamist resistance. And we wouldn't, speak for that. So I think it's just being kind of, like you said, that making sure that the analysis is coherent and that it's correct.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Okay, good. So, okay, so one other question is, what is the relationship between oppression and submission? How does the experience of oppression alter the perception of the idea of submission, example, submission before God, in a way that is incommensurable to the global dominant class?
Can you repeat that? That's a lot in there.
Yeah, let me just.
I think I get it. How can you have submission, but it's not basically to an oppressive structure, right? But it's submitted to the will of God. Yeah, I think I'll give an example of a teacher of mine who was Amir Abdul Malik, and in one of his khutbas, probably now 18 years ago, in the beginning stage of the war on terror, he was giving a khutbah, and in that khutbah he had mentioned that he was talking about his own experience, and he was talking about how when he was a nationalist and something like that, and he was thinking about self-conceptualizations at who he was, and he was thinking of himself as the rebel against the system, right? And then when he made the transition to Islam, something clicked, and he realized, and his phrase was, now I realize that it's the white man is the rebel. He rebelled against God. And so this concept of, so if you are within the world of Islam, you're submitted to a particular kind of divinity. And under that submitted state, you cannot be an aggressor towards other fellow beings in the way that the colonizer is. So you're actually submitted. The rebel is the one who actually has a false notion of sovereignty, who actually questions divine sovereignty. So from the perspective of Islam, submission is you're submitted to the will of Allah and the laws of Allah and the powers of Allah. So there's a different kind of inspiration. You're submitted to that. So world structures that claim to be sovereign and they want to dominate you or oppress you, it's actually you're obligated to fight against that kind of oppression. So that wouldn't be submission, obviously, right? So to submit to oppression would be, a kind of a forced situation in which the Muslim is there. That's where the inevitability of jihad becomes foundational.
One question is, can you speak on the solidarity between the Palestinian Muslims and Palestinian Christians at this time?
I can't speak that much from the ground, but I know from looking at the news and looking at media reports that the Christians, when the churches are being bombed and so on, and there's a tremendous kind of sense of trying to preserve that community in Gaza, in which the Christians are not saying anything. I've yet to see anything antagonistic towards even the resistance, because it could easily be someone could try to convince like a Christian perspective that, hey, if this Hamas people didn't do this, then you wouldn't have to go through this. There's no complaint about the resistance. They're entirely focused on Israeli aggression and Israeli bombing and Israeli genocide, which includes the Palestinian Christians. So in this sense, it is very, very clear to me that at that level, there is quite a bit of interaction and a degree of collaboration in the level that they want to support each other. That's kind of obvious to me, but we should keep an eye on the news and see how they're sensing. But it is true, though, that there's a history of class in Palestine in which the Christians did have more access to wealth and so on, that we should also think about. And it's important to think about that question. But at this point, at the level of, in terms of Gaza and what's happening in terms of genocide, of course, the Christians are very as targeted right now. They're not left alone.
Yeah,
And I would assume, sorry to add,
I would
assume that part of it is because the Israelis think that even the churches are like shelters for Islamism or something like that. I would assume that that's what the Israelis think, or at least that's how they justify it.
Yeah, no, I was just gonna echo that. I think in direct confrontation with this level of violence, the distinction is not as important, I would say. And I think that's just like, the solidarity there is almost kind of immediate. And so that's my reaction to that. There was a question, someone was interested that when you were speaking on the notion of obligation within the tradition of Islam, you mentioned that struggle was a form of something. She said it was a beautiful idea, but can't remember the language you used. I'm also trying to remember what it was, but do you remember?
Obligation.
You mentioned that struggle was a form of maybe obligation. I'm not sure, but maybe we can get back to that if you remember. But I just wanted to put it out there because I think this person was seriously interested.
I'm glad they were interested in that. I don't remember the language. I'm not reading notes. I'm kind of spontaneously answering a
Yes,
lot of these
yes.
questions. Um,
One other question is, what's the one here? Oh, I think we talked about this, but I'll provide some context. So the question is, how would you describe the moment in time we are living through, and what are some of the key characteristics of this moment in history? So some context is grounding the question for this question is thinking the moment of the evolution of capitalism, escalated colonization, and the number of people struggles on different and a number of different continents. What's your assessment of this moment that we're currently living in?
I feel like the person who's asking the question already is giving some answers. Yeah. So at that level, I think they're talking about the expansion of capital, which I agree with. I do believe the intensity of colonization. I agree with that. But I think what is left out of that picture is a kind of contemporary history of anti-Islam and anti-Islamism, um, which has to be taken very, very seriously. And going back to my first point originally, I think was that anti-Islam is not simply a product of only capitalism and colonialism. Anti-Islam was there actually before the emergence of capital. And it's not clear that at the end of the abolition of capital, that there wouldn't be anti-Islam. We're not sure. So my job as an anthropologist of Islam and Islamism specifically, I look at our current moment and want to kind of trace that history of anti-Islam and the history of counterterrorism, which is kind of inflected with that history.
Yes, and I want to thank the commenters as well, because you said that struggle was a form of worship. So they all typed it in. So thank you guys so much for that.
Thank you.
Sounds good. Um, okay, so one question that came about was, how does this conversation about terrorism and a universal Islam relate to Wahhabi hegemony and political positionalities under the umbrella of Islam? Thinking about Iran, Saudi, Yemen, and Palestinian liberation versus Gulf state Wahhabi capitalists. So it's a lot of things in one. But I guess I would ask for maybe your immediate reaction
Yeah,
to
my
that.
immediate reaction is actually I totally understand what's at stake for this person, the question who's asking this question. I do think that Wahhabism also actually has a nuanced history. So it's not always simply what the Saudi regime is doing is Wahhabi. Wahhabism is has a very specific genealogy, and some of it is actually important for the history of very specific forms of Islamism that came out of the Gulf states, the looser networks of formations that have troubled a lot of the Western interventions, particularly in specific parts of East Africa, for example, and North Africa. So I wouldn't, and then there's also the genealogy of Salafism, which has a relationship with the genealogy of Wahhabism, but there are different genealogies. If Salafism is sort of the bigger circle, and Wahhabism is a smaller circle within that, if you think of that question. Having said that, I do think there are certain states that are working very much within the logic of Western capital and Western hegemony, and there are Islamist movements that are fighting against it, and we have to be very, very, very specific about this. And we're also thinking about the emergence of a unipolar kind of US domination after the end of the Cold War. And so the logic of that is very, very different. So we'd have to be very specific about which era we're talking about. And then we can assess each case. And one of the this is something for the audience. One of the problems of being a scholar of Islamism is that you don't take one grand position on all of Islamism. You kind of have to be case by case, situation by situation, and be very, very in tune with the ground. And you want to understand what the debates and contestations are all about. And one of the phrases or some of the phrasing of even counterterrorism, war on terror, is to actually call everybody Wahhabi and then calling them extremists and terrorists and then attacking them. So that's another problem. So I don't use that term too, carelessly. So, so I guess that's my answer. I don't know if it's too clear, but that's the answer. I hope it was useful though.
That sounds good. So we have repeatedly seen, and I think we've talked a little bit about this, but we can expand. We have repeatedly seen moralistic claims that Israel makes against the Islamist resistance of Gaza turn out to be true of itself, of the IOF. It seems almost like a projection of their own guilt, as if they expect the eye for an eye principle. What does this tell us about the Western notion of justice and revenge? Does the Islamic notion of righteous war transcend this notion of justice? Does it challenge the Western notion of justice?
Yeah, that's a really good question. That's a question. Is it a question from the audience? Wow. That's a really good question. I always wanted to think through that question because I actually think I am not very satisfied with having empty notions of justice. You know how people go to protest and stuff and they talk about no peace, no justice and stuff like that. But normally when they think or when you actually try to understand from people, what are they talking about when they mean justice? It ends up being some kind of Western human rights discourse of justice, or like a Western republicanism as a form of justice, or Western democracy as a form of justice. So yes, I think Islamism actually deeply critiques the normative notions of justice that we have from the political philosophy of liberalism. And unfortunately, much of the left is duped into thinking that that's going to save us. It's not going to save us. So that notion of justice is not going to do nothing. There has to be material social relations has to be completely rearranged. We have to think about the destruction of the planet at the level of the environment. We have to think about the destruction of the planet at the level of capitalism, of course, as a systemic structure. And we also have to think about this history of the modern world in which the enemy has to be constructed, and the enemy happens to be, for the notion of the political, for Europe, has to be the Muslim. And that is where the genealogies work. That is how we have to think through. So yes, I mean, the very notion of justice is actually that we know of from liberal political philosophy is deeply flawed. It's not going to save us. It's not going to take us anywhere. Islamism has its own concepts, and that's a whole nother conversation, huge conversation. Yeah.
Yeah. One question, and I think people are interested about just the concept and role of religion in the Islamic form. One is, why do you think the Western world is so nihilistic and often prone to atheism? There is often a notion that religion is only for the uneducated.
I mean, why is the Western world interested in atheism, et cetera, et cetera?
Nihilistic, I guess.
Well, I'm not so sure. I think, there's something called ideology, which is, there's a reason why. Okay, so when you read Marx, for example, I read my Marx, sorry. But when you read Marx and you look at the early and late Marx, and you see a transition from focusing on the critique of religion to the critique of the commodity form. And it's very interesting why Marx makes that transition, because he actually understands that most people are actually going to be ideologically formed at the level of how they think through the commodity form and their relations within that kind of political economic structure, in which religion will not be the dominant force of how one is ideologically part of the capitalist system. So, and of course, there's works by Walter Benjamin and others who think about capitalism as a form of a kind of religious, it promotes a particular kind of desire, particular kinds of pleasure, particular notions of subjectivity, particular understanding of freedom, right? If you can buy Coke instead of Pepsi, that's a form of choice, you know? So this is the kind of stuff that capitalism has its own concepts of everything. So I think people are deeply actually in a state of worship. From the Islamist perspective, all of these people are deeply in a state of worship of a particular kind of worldview, a particular notion of sovereignty, which is very different from the Islamic notion of sovereignty. So I think this is the point. So I don't think people are actually atheist, because I think they are worshiping something, probably money, probably a particular social relations, probably a particular system of governance, particular kind of state. They're obeying the state. They obey the law of the state. They obey the white man. That's their religion. So that's basically what's happening. They obey the Israelis. You know what I mean? Like that's basically something we have to be very, very serious before we do sort of, and this is not the person who's asking the question because he's right or she's right or they're right. But the thing is, we have to know that it's not only religious people who have certain kinds of desire. Everybody is worshiping and have different forms of desire. And a lot of that is actually messed up. It's produced by the system.
Yeah, no, I definitely appreciate that, because I think, just to echo the questioner, and I think it goes back to this again, the deeper and larger anxiety that I feel like a lot of the West feels when it comes to Muslims and Muslim presence and Islam and Islamism in general, because it's this idea of, like, religion. But when you complicate the idea of religion in that way, you understand that just like as a form, like we're all kind of submitting our will to something.
That's right. And I also want to actually quickly mention this. This is probably late in the game to say this, but Islam also is not a religion. That's the religion is, Gil Anajar has a phrase, and I'm now paraphrasing. He says, religion is the name Christianity gives itself secularism is the name Christianity gives itself when it invents religion. So religion is this small thing that so-called, primitive people follow, and then all these modern people are secular. This is kind of the biased view that we get from Western Christianity all the way into Western secularity. And this is why Islam is looked upon, and other modes of life, particularly also indigenous forms of life, are looked down upon, because they're looked down upon as the religions and ways of life of people who are primitive. Right? So this is, again, the Israelis think Palestinians have this kind of primitive religion, and that's why they're fighting like this, and et cetera, et cetera. They want to promote that view. That's the part of the Israeli propaganda as well. So Islam actually doesn't want to be just a particular of a religion. It wants to be the social order. That's actually the political vision that it has, and that's why it has an antagonism with Western secularity. And this is a very important part of Islam, actually, Islamic movement in particular. Islamism is precisely what it is, because it resists this notion that it's a religion, which is forced from the outside. It's a complete way of life, including notion of economy, notion of the political, notion of what could be worshipped, notion of law, notion of what is peoplehood. All of that is part of Islamism. It's not just some religion that you do in like some activities on the side and then join back into the secular world. And this is why it's a totality.
Thank you so much, Tanzeen, for that, for your presence, for answering the questions. I think a lot of us really benefited from this conversation about really interrogating, like, Islamic struggle and Islam and Islamism, and really for those of us who are principles organizers who want to take seriously the task of understanding where this, again, this Islamic resistance is coming from, and what tradition gives rise to this kind of like revolutionary kind of impetus that we see, like, as a theological obligation. We thank you, for your presence, for answering our questions. I want to give you the floor to say any last closing words.
I'd like to thank all the organizations that sponsored it, and for your courage to have someone who's actually very serious about the question of Islamism. And I'd like to thank you, Isra, for moderating this conversation. And I'd like to thank all of the audience and those who are going to be seeing the recorded version of this. Thank you very much. It was a great pleasure. And Assalamu alaikum.
Awesome. Yes, and just one last question: where can people find you if they want to hear from you, read, anything? Where can they find you?
There is an academia page for some academic articles. My podcast is recorded, but it's going to get released soon. Milestones is a journal in which I do editing. I'm at University of Pittsburgh currently as a visiting assistant professor, so there is some information there as well. You can always contact me via email and so on. Yeah, I'm not
Awesome.
super active, unfortunately, in the social media.
No, that's good. But, alhamdulillah, maybe a lot of people can find you at Milestones Journal and Everything is Fire podcast when it's released. There's some really great politically, coherent, analysis coming from those, sources. So please check that out. Again, I want to thank everyone for joining us here tonight. Again, you can find us here next Tuesday at 7 p.m. Eastern Time. Thank you. And I hope all of you have a wonderful night.
Thank you very much.
Assalamu alaikum.